Everybody doing all right? Questions, issues by everybody? I mean, all three of you? And all five watching later? Do we have one more lecture after this before the next quiz? Is that right?
I think that next week is,
Oh, two more.
well,
Tells you what I know.
this is like the first one, right?
Oh, yeah, because we're splitting this one in two. That's right. Yeah, we're halving this one. So, all right. Well, we'll hopefully get through this at least. We talked about the blues last time. I want to talk about jazz this time. Arguably the quintessential American art form, which is an African American art form, which is to say, I mean, you could make the case that this is America's greatest contribution to culture, and it is distinctly an African American cultural form. It's born probably, I mean, if you had to pick, I mean, and I think many people, musicologists, historians would argue and say, well, just like the blues, there's no one birthplace. It takes shape with many different people or performers in different places, but if you had to pick somewhere, it would be New Orleans. It's born there among brass bands. Brass bands with snare drum players that adopted military-style brass band parades that they organized through mutual aid societies like we talked about for things like, I mean, obviously entertainment, but also funerals. And so these are people playing European instruments like the trumpet or the cornet or the trombone, but eventually playing it in a style that's all their own, and particularly in what they come to be known as the second line parades, where you would have these brass bands with a drummer that would parade through the streets of the neighborhood on, you know, for whatever occasion. But people from the community would fall in. So the first line would be the band itself, but people from the community would fall in behind and dance throughout the streets, and that'd be the second line. And of course, these bands also ended up playing in the dance halls and the clubs and the brothels of the city. Again, European instruments, European melodies sometimes, but eventually with African rhythms. And with the element of what we might call swing. To make these old school European melodies with these European instruments swing. And this is something that is difficult to describe in an academic sense, but like blatantly obvious if you're listening to it. Swing is not bound by strict rules in terms of melody, in terms of beat. It's about falling into a groove. It's about showing out. Imagine, you know, I think about if you go to a high school football game and you got the high school band, you know, playing some arrangement of some song, and everything is exactly going to be where it's supposed to be. But imagine then the same song where people are freer to sort of fall in where they may. And again, it's difficult to describe in the academic sense, but everything doesn't have to necessarily be exactly on a perfect downbeat. Jazz incorporates, along with the blues, the combination of form and also improvisation, and allowing for emoting, allowing for soloists to sort of show out. I mentioned this when we talked about the blues and the 1-4-5 pattern and the 12-bar pattern, but also always room for guitarists and harp players to show out. The same is true here with a typical jazz structure of a jazz number. You would play through the melody twice, and then you would go around, and then the trumpet player gets to take a solo, the cornet player gets to take a solo, the trombone player gets to take a solo, and so on. And you come back around, you play the melody again, and that's the song. But back to swing for a minute, and I know I've skipped whatever, I've forgotten in a year what the hell these links are, but, I skipped over whatever link that is to talk about the second line parades. Whoever or whatever it is gonna do a much better job of explaining this than me, I promise you that.
Imagine the places
Unless it's an
that
expedient commercial, in which case, you know. Yes, Wynton Marsalis, one of, arguably the America's greatest jazz ambassador living right now. It's an album he and his father produced. Now I want you to imagine though, when you listen to this, imagine if it was like, again, and I hesitate almost to say marching band style, because there are some marching bands that are like, they can swing and kick ass, but imagine if it were perfectly structured as the way it is on the sheet music, that this would be dun 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 dun, and it's not the way it is, it's swinging into the notes at different times. That's Wynton Marsalis on trumpet and his father on piano. And so they would play through that melody twice, and then Ellis Marsalis, his father, would play solo on the piano, and then Wynton plays a solo on the trumpet. They play the melody again, and that's that. But that just hopefully gives you an example of what it means in terms of swing as opposed to like a straight beat. And here's the
This rhythm is called Trecio.
God, that's really loud. At least it's not an ad. Ed Sheedy making an appearance. And that's apropos. I mean, when we talk about jazz and blues, I mean, American music is nothing without the jazz, without jazz and the blues. And so even if you're looking at like modern day, 2020 pop, there are elements that you could trace back to jazz and the blues. And this English kid's gonna do a good job of explaining specifically the Trecio beat, which Wynton Marsalis, who we were just listening to, said that there is no jazz without the Trecio beat. This is a West African polyrhythm that makes its way into the Caribbean and into American jazz in places like New Orleans, and you turn on pop radio right now, and it's all over the place, and you just may not realize it.
Yeah. You may not have heard that name before, but you've definitely heard this rhythm before. To most ears, this rhythm has a sort of Caribbean sound, a sort of island sound, and there's good reason for that. This rhythm has deep roots in the Caribbean, but it didn't start in the Caribbean. This rhythm started its journey in sub-Saharan Africa. It was then introduced to the New World when it was brought over to the Caribbean during the Atlantic slave trade. This rhythm became very popular in Cuba, where it became the foundation of the Cuban dance style called contradanza. The music of contradanza soon reached Europe and became known as the habanera, or the dance of Havana. And habanera makes one small change to the Trecio rhythm, which is adding a backbeat. And a classic example of this habanera rhythm is in the classic aria from the opera Carmen. couple decades later, the Tracy O also played a part in the evolution of ragtime music into early jazz. Musicians would often take the ferry from New Orleans to Havana, and they would pick up this rhythm whilst they were there. You can hear the Tracy O here in the left-hand bass line for Jelly Roll's New Orleans Blues. The Tracy O also inspired another heavily influential rhythm, the Charleston. James P. Johnson, who was the stride pianist who wrote the Charleston, learnt the Tracy O from the dock workers in South Carolina and made one small change to it to turn it into the legendary Charleston. All he did was remove the last beat. But what really introduced this rhythm to modern pop music was the Jamaican style of music dancehall. You can hear it here in the massively influential dancehall track Dembo by Shabba Ranks. Now this rhythm became so closely associated with dancehall and dembo that it actually started being called the dembo rhythm. And it then went on to influence other styles of Caribbean music like reggaeton, which is a style of music from Puerto Rico. So soon enough, dancehall and reggaeton started reaching the Western mainstream pop charts. At first, it was native Caribbean and Latin American artists like Sean Paul, Beanie Man, Daddy Yankee, and Shakira who started popularizing the rhythm. About 2015-2016, the rhythm and the style had become a massive influence on American and European producers and songwriters. They don't need to give you nothing. They don't want you to have nothing. They don't want to see me find nothing. Why to the left, sway to the right, drop it down low, take it back high. In your eyes, they all over me. Don't be shy, take control of me. So next time you're listening to the radio and hear that Tracy O rhythm, you now know what journey it went on to get there.
It was the first day I'd ever been in with Steve. Literally the first thing he did was he walked over to a keyboard and played. And then I was kind of like, oh yeah, that's a good start.
John,
So, I think I mentioned this when we talked about the blues. Jazz pretty quickly spreads out of New Orleans and throughout the rest of the country, and by no accident. If we're looking at the early 20th century into the 1930s, it's the period of the Great Migration, African Americans leaving the South in historic numbers for cities throughout the Midwest, the Northeast, the West, from New York to Chicago to San Francisco and Los Angeles. And they take this musical form with them, and in fact, to the point where, I mean, the 1920s become, known as the jazz age. It becomes all the rage, all the clubs, the speakeasies, the illegal alcohol serving establishments during Prohibition. Jazz is the music that's being played. And the great figure of jazz in this period is probably Louis Armstrong there. One of the great sons of New Orleans. A cornet and trumpet player, a scat or improvisational vocalist who played as a young man on the riverboats down in New Orleans, up and down the Mississippi River. I mean, literally on the riverboats as jazz is making its way literally up the river, where cities like Memphis and St. Louis and eventually Chicago. he ends up recording, in fact, in Chicago, and ends up playing in huge clubs in New York City and Los Angeles. Sometimes, especially in the case of New York, playing to audiences that included notorious mafia or mob bosses, again during the era of Prohibition. Clubs like the Cotton Club, for example, in Harlem. But migration leads to the development of other styles. You eventually get what they call the big band style, where you've got a band leader and a huge stage full of different horn players, and eventually drummers and bass players, and later guitar players. And that later morphs into the small band sort of style that we associate with rock and roll today. But then too, in between those two, you get what they call bop by the 1940s. A small band, sort of super hyper improvisational, really intense emotional style of jazz. Again, it would become popular in the 40s and 50s, maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. But these are all key steps in the development of rock and roll as we know it, which would of course be foundational to pop, as you just saw. Also was influenced by other styles. If you heard that guy mention ragtime, which is a syncopated piano style associated with artists like Scott Joplin and others. So about these outward migrations, though, moving away for a little bit from music. Between 1865 and 1910, 250,000 black people left the South. That's not nearly as many as during the Great Migration in 1915 to 1940, but it's still a hugely significant number. Many of these people went west, of course, as we've seen. We talked about the exodusters who went to Kansas and Oklahoma to work as farmers in all black towns, but others went further west and worked as cowboys. And still others went west to train as the Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers went from western forts to Florida in advance of a deployment to Cuba in the Spanish-American War. And in Florida, of course, they encountered Jim Crow, facing the irony of liberating Cuba from Spanish rule. At the same time, they faced discrimination and second-class citizenship right there at home while serving their country. Perhaps keenly aware of that fact, a lot of black people left the United States entirely and immigrated to Liberia, a country in West Africa established in the 1820s for free blacks. At the same time, many West Africans and those from the British Caribbean migrated to America. So you have a lot of African Americans who came into this country post-slavery from Africa, from the Caribbean, from other parts of the world, whose descendants are not slaves, or whose ancestors rather. And again, of course, the key component of this great migration was African Americans leaving the South for cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and West, particularly in the context of industrialization, the Second Industrial Revolution, and the growth of factory work, wage-earning work in cities, again, from New York and Philadelphia and Boston to Chicago and Cleveland and Minneapolis and all the way out to Denver and San Francisco and Seattle. And in particular, if we're talking about moving to New York, we're going to talk about Harlem and how it becomes the hub of an artistic renaissance in the 1920s in terms of literature and the visual arts and so on. We'll talk about the Harlem Renaissance in the next lecture. But I want to spotlight two individuals here to close this lecture out. Two individuals that have traditionally been by historians like juxtaposed with one another, meaning like placed beside one another and compared and contrasted. And typically historians would have highlighted their contrasts and said, you know, these guys represent two completely different ideologies or viewpoints. More recently, historians have suggested that it's not quite so starkly different, the viewpoints or the ideologies of these two men. So just keep that in mind. I mean, again, that maybe, according to historians right now, we have overstated the stark differences, supposedly, of these two individuals' messages. And the first is, of course, Booker T. Washington, founder of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, in Macon County, Alabama, East Alabama.
Founder of what?
I'm sorry?
The founder of what?
He founded Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University. And I think I've talked very briefly about Booker T. Washington earlier.
His wife, right?
Yeah, at the very beginning, and his wife, right? We were talking about Margaret Murray Washington. Well, Booker T. Washington is the founder of Tuskegee Institute, which again becomes Tuskegee University in East Alabama. Washington is the champion of the idea of uplift. We did talk about this. The idea of uplift through interracial cooperation and through what you might call accommodationism. This ideology would stress that you ought to accept certain realities of the day, like segregation. It is what it is. Learn to live with it. Accommodate it. Focus instead on racial pride, on racial solidarity, and that politics of respectability. Show white people that black people can be respectable, successful members of society, and maybe you'll change their mind about your own inferiority. Focus instead again on racial pride and solidarity, and in Booker T. Washington's case, focus even more closely on vocational or industrial education. That was the initial purpose of Tuskegee University, to teach people the vocations. And this would theoretically bring economic independence, that would bring success. You would show white people you could be successful, and again, in the long term, hopefully change their minds about racial inferiority. The flip side of this is that confrontation is not the way to go. Don't confront the racial order. Don't try to upend the racial order directly through what we call direct action. For this would only lead to disaster and a hopeless path of failure. Washington was born to a slave mother and a white father in Virginia. The family moved to West Virginia after the Civil War. And at age 16, he walked 500 miles to enroll at Hampton. We talked about Hampton, one of the first HBCUs with its connection to being one of the original, in fact, contraband camp under Benjamin Butler, General Benjamin Butler during the war. The Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. And there he established a close relationship with the president of Hampton, who brought him back to teach there, and then arranged for him to go down south into Alabama and establish Tuskegee. The very first students at Tuskegee initially learned bricklaying so that they could literally build the school from the ground up on the site of an old plantation. Down in the Alabama Black Belt, down there in Macon County, where the soil was so rich and conducive to growing long staple cotton and so dark and black that they call it the Black Belt. That is where he established Tuskegee, and the students built it from the ground up. By his death, it had 1,500 students and sat on 3,500 acres and included 100 buildings. Functioned as a normal school. Remember, normal schools were for teachers, and also an agricultural and vocational school. I mentioned that vocational education was important to Washington. Part of his job while there at Tuskegee was fundraising, including from northern white philanthropists like the tycoons of industry, the so-called robber barons, like Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, founders of Sears and Roebuck, particularly Julius Rosenwald. Rosenwald funded a program for Tuskegee architects to design black schools in poor and rural areas all throughout the South. He established the so-called Rosenwald Fund, which eventually led to the building and opening of 5,000 plus schools, K through 12 schools for black kids all throughout the South. Some of those Rosenwald schools still stand today. From Tuskegee, Washington builds a network of influential friends that comes to be known as the Tuskegee Machine. His influence in politics extended even at times to the presidency, where he shares the counsel of Presidents McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, and Taft. His most notable speech is probably his 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech, in which he lays out the core of his philosophy, that black people should work within the confines of Jim Crow, but white people should not hesitate to employ them, as opposed to, say, immigrant foreign workers. Black people could then use self-help, industrial education, and racial solidarity to uplift themselves. Such a speech allows different people to hear what they want to hear. Frederick Douglass died that same year. You remember Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist? People begin to look to Booker T. Washington as the leading black American figure. As we're going to see, not everyone did. We're going to look at an individual next who called Washington the great accommodator, and he did not mean that in a nice way. He means you refuse to stand up to white supremacy, which is what we really ought to be doing. In turn, Washington would call people like that, those who are calling for racial agitation, those who espouse the, quote, extremist folly, meaning you're headed for nothing but failure by being an extremist and directly confronting white supremacy. His autobiographical work is called Up From Slavery, which encapsulates that thesis of racial accommodation and uplift. This is how we lift ourselves up by our bootstraps, if you will. In a play on that, one historian has recently published a biography of Washington entitled Up From History. The thesis of which is that we have buried Booker T. Washington under this unflattering now shroud of accommodationism, and suggested, like, you know, he was what you might call an Uncle Tom, somebody who allowed white people to push him around and who was too afraid perhaps to confront the white supremacist order and so on. And that this historian is saying that was never the case. We have caricatured Booker T. Washington, and the real Booker T. Washington looks quite different. He privately spent a tremendous amount of money on litigation, that is lawsuits that were aimed at tearing down Jim Crow segregation. And you have to consider too that his way was widely considered the only feasible means of black uplift in the South at that time. Directly confronting white supremacy and segregation and disenfranchisement were literally unthinkable to a majority of people. And so Washington offers for you the only feasible means of uplift. And then consider too that critics in his time, especially Du Bois, who we're about to look at, were resentful of his success. And then later critics would judge him by the standards of their own time, for example, the 1960s, as opposed to the standards of the time. Let's talk about Du Bois, though. And many a grad student, including yours truly, have sat down at a graduate seminar table and thought they knew something about something and began pontificating on W.E.B. Du Bois, because isn't it a French name and shouldn't that be how it's pronounced? Well, that's not how he pronounced it, and that's not how anybody else does. It is Du Bois. The leading critic of the Washington Uplift approach, favoring instead civil rights agitation, litigation, filing lawsuits, and what we call direct action. Now, he too called for economic self-sufficiency and hard work, arguing that the, quote, talented tenth of African Americans would rise to the top and become black leaders of the future through advanced higher education, but not vocational education. More traditional, what you might call liberal arts style education. And that they then might challenge white supremacy directly. Unlike Booker T. Washington, Du Bois was born after the war to a family that had long been free in Massachusetts. But he comes down south and attends Fisk, HBCU in Nashville that we talked about. Gets his undergraduate degree and then earns a PhD from Harvard University. He's the first black man to obtain a PhD from Harvard, America's oldest and most storied academic institution. He then comes back south to teach at Atlanta University. And just as segregation and disenfranchisement were becoming entrenched, Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois diverge. Du Bois calls for education again in the liberal arts and the advanced sciences, and advocated a top-down, again, talented tenth approach to change that some would criticize as maybe elitist. But Du Bois becomes an increasingly vocal and outspoken critic of segregation and disenfranchisement. His magnum opus, his great work, is The Souls of Black Folks, in which he argues that Booker T. Washington's approach is dictatorial and that he uses the Tuskegee machine to punish all of his critics, and argues that Washington's plan means that black people had to abandon any hope of political power, civil rights, or higher education. And that shifts the burden for black uplift to black people alone, when Du Bois would argue this is the nation's problem. One of his most famous quotations, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And Du Bois meant this for the world, not just the United States. He's an advocate, an early advocate of what we call Pan-Africanism. Something that more closely becomes associated with figures that we'll talk about later, like Marcus Garvey. Pan-Africanism involves the identification of the African diaspora and Africans as a shared community. When I say diaspora, I mean when you have a people, particularly who have been forcibly spread throughout the world, that is through the slave trade, and whose roots trace back to sub-Saharan Africa, West, Southwest, Southeast Africa, but who end up strewn throughout the Caribbean, Latin America, and the United States, and elsewhere. We call that a diaspora, similar to the Jewish people who end up far flung throughout Europe and the Western Hemisphere from their roots in the Levant. If you are someone who espouses Pan-Africanism, then you identify the African diaspora as a shared community. The idea that all of those people should be working together for the betterment of one another. As such, he was a critic of imperialism, of the ideas of social Darwinism and the concept of a white man's burden. An advocate of independence for colonized nations of Africa and elsewhere. In 1905, he founds the Niagara Movement, a group of black intellectuals and civil rights advocates who are all critical of Booker T. Washington and his machine and his approach, who called for an immediate end to segregation, for voting rights for African Americans, and for equal educational opportunity. Among his early noted supporters was Ida Wells, who we looked at closely just a week or two ago. In 1906, Du Bois firsthand witnessed the Atlanta race riot that we talked about. A similar quote-unquote riot unfolds 2 years later in Springfield, Illinois, and demonstrated the national character of racism, not just the Southern character. Du Bois was keenly aware that racism was always an American problem and not just a Southern one. These events also led prominent black and white intellectuals and reformers to meet in 1909 and to form an organization committed to ending racial discrimination and inequality. Initially, it was called the National Negro Committee. It was renamed in 1910 the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Among the original members are Du Bois, Ida Wells, Oswald Garrison Villard, and Jane Addams. Jane Addams is associated with the progressive movement. She's a white woman who opens a settlement house for immigrants in Chicago known as Hull House. It becomes a model for other progressive establishments throughout the country that are concerned with the plight of immigrants and the working class. So this is notably a biracial institution, the NAACP, which opens its headquarters in New York City and eventually branch offices in cities throughout the entire country, which it maintains to this very day. Du Bois works as the director of publicity for the NAACP and was in charge of research and was the editor of the NAACP's publication, The Crisis, in which he published, like Ida Wells, statistics on lynching, wide-ranging news coverage, and opinion pieces. For the NAACP, the focus is increasingly on litigation, fighting against segregation and disenfranchisement in court. And this remains the mainstay of the NAACP through its sister organization, the Legal Defense and Education Fund, which is inaugurated somewhat later than this period, but is responsible for the great victories in court that we'll talk about once we get into the 1950s and 60s. Before you get there, before World War II in the 1940s, the victories are few and far between. At least the NAACP was able to get some cities to ban the film Birth of a Nation, a film glorifying the Ku Klux Klan and advancing the so-called lost cause mythology of the old white South, and the idea that the Ku Klux Klan came about to bring back law and order to a South ravaged by the excesses and inadequacies of Black Reconstruction. And the NAACP was at least able to get the Supreme Court to hand down a favorable ruling in Wynn versus United States in 1915, in which the court strikes down the grandfather clause, which we talked about in here. Grandfather clauses allowed discriminatory enforcement of mechanisms like the poll tax and literacy tests and so on. That same year, 1915, Booker T. Washington dies. And this makes W.E.B. Du Bois the unquestioned intellectual leader of Black America. Just as the idea that we'll talk about in the next lecture, the idea of the new Negro begins to blossom. An idea that was much more in touch with Du Bois's ethos than Washington's. And so in the next lecture, we will explore that philosophy and that concept of the new Negro. We'll talk about Marcus Garvey, Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, and the Harlem Renaissance. Questions about anything? All right, well that's it for today. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you next week.